Genesis of the Daleks is... See, what I'm struggling with here is, how am I supposed to find anything new to say about one of the most important stories in Doctor Who's history? And one that, well, I revere so greatly for a number of reasons I'll get to throughout this video, but in a story that has been revered for 5 decades as one of the best of all time, and has therefore been analysed into the ground, my biggest issue when writing this was kind of thinking, what can I say about this? Well, I can but speak about my own feelings about this story, and admit that, well, this was the second ever classic story I ever saw. Consider me a Doctor Who mad 8-year-old in the grand old year of 2006. God, was that nearly 20 years ago? The lack of Who after the end of Series 2 gnawing at me, until a relative bought me 2 DVDs for Christmas, which are presently on the screen as you can see them. Carnival of Monsters and this story. These 2 DVDs are still part of my collection. Admittedly, Carnival now has a special edition, so that's what I'd actually use to watch it, but those 2 DVDs are nevertheless still there almost 2 decades on. And well, they got me permanently hooked on the classic series, and it's doubtful I'd be here all that time telling you how much better it is than NuWho, had it not be for them. So, this is a special story for me, one which showed me how good the 26 years I'd previously only been vaguely aware of could be, and set up a fan for life. But while that's a nice tale, what does this story mean to me all that time later? Well, it provides me a nice contrast as to how I appreciated the story then and how I do now. Then it was exciting and bold, yet careful and paced, no rushing as I found annoying in NuWho even as a child. And now, well, it's all those things, but also is a remarkably prescient piece about fascism and morality, and ties in those themes to create a piece that makes the Daleks feel as powerful, and indeed as character as they ever would be for the entire of the 70s and 80s, despite only really becoming the Daleks as we know them in the closing minutes of Part 6. Yet, because it is so well structured, this never doesn't feel like their story, like we really are watching this history being made. Released from the shackles of bored indifference, Terry Nation provides a story which really feels like his passion is back into the Daleks, while the fingerprints of Robert Holmes are all over this and giving it the wit and depth it needed. It feels like it's a bold new step for the Daleks and for Doctor Who, very different from traditional adventures that have been used to mostly not very good effect for the Dalek stories of the Pertwee era. In fact, the only times Genesis really falters are when it feels like it has to go back to business as usual Who. The giant clams, for instance, or the silly cliffhanger where Sarah falls from the gantry, only for it to transpire she didn't really. Those are minor things that don't at all detract from the overall success, of course, where the combination of plot, theme and character is pitch perfect throughout. I do love the story and intend to sing its praises. But that's where the initial problem rears again. What is there to say that nobody else has said? Can I make any original observations? Well, I suppose we'll find out. As much as I wish it were the case, I can't just play back me watching it and going, I like that. So I'll try, but I might moan about it while doing it. Such is how things can be. Genesis of the Daleks has a fairly well-known genesis. While Barry Letts was still producer, he was commissioning stories for season 12 that would eventually be steered by Philip Hinchcliffe in the producer's chair, and Letts asked Nation for a Dalek story. Nation proceeded to write pretty much exactly the same plot as the previous 2 stories, which led to Letts, probably with more exasperation than he would admit when retelling it later, to ask Nation to try something different, to go back to the genesis of the Daleks. That lit up something in Nation, and well, here we are. It's important to note that despite the mediocrity of the Pertwee era Dalek stories, the creatures remain popular, and have been included in all those instances for ratings purposes, which did largely succeed. With a new Doctor and a new direction for the series, bringing them back for buzz again was not exactly a surprising move. It is, however, a sign of how burnt out Letts and co were that they were bringing about the Daleks when all involved were clearly not huge fans of them. And indeed you get the feeling Hinchcliffe wasn't a huge fan of the Pepperpots either, given he never used them again during his time on the show. Indeed, Genesis does sort of bring an end to this era of the Daleks that started with Day. After this it would be another 4 years before they appeared again, then another 5 years after that. The mini-boom in Dalek stories came to an end here, therefore, and it wouldn't be until NuWho that there was such a concentration of them again. Unlike the original Dalek Mania, which this wasn't really a cultural thing, just a succession of attempted ratings boosts, and I think nothing makes that clear in how little really any connects these 4 stories. Beyond that, 2 of them are crap and 1 of them is only really average. I'm not sure this is therefore really any new mini-Dalek phenomenon, and therefore Genesis shouldn't be looked at as this burning desire to answer more questions about the Daleks. And yet, I think it's the better for that. This isn't following a trend or obsessing over some desire to explain every tiny detail, as would no doubt be the case today. Indeed, this is more or less totally incompatible with the first Dalek story continuity-wise, which is amusing given how most franchises bend over backwards to explain tiny holes in continuity. Nope, not in Doctor Who. The most visible and well-known figures of the franchise have 2 wildly incompatible origins, and that's why we love it. But anyway, Genesis is much better because of that. It's not filling in some desperate questions or anything like that. The focus is where it should be. The story, the characters, the themes. The story is strong because it is showing the birth of the Daleks in a way that is consistent and fits with everything else. It focuses on its characters instead of relevant questions, and its laser focus gives it thematic strength. Genesis of the Daleks is for me a sign of what classic Who could do right and what NuWho would do very disastrously wrong. And for once that's not me actually disparaging NuWho, it's just a symptom of how media production and consumption has changed. Nobody watched Star Wars 2 years after the story was broadcast thinking, if only the plot hole of why the Death Star has that flaw could be filled. And yet, in 2016, they made a whole movie out of it, and it did pretty well at the box office. So I'm not blaming NuWho, but my god, can you imagine if they did this today? You wouldn't be able to move for all the callbacks and references and fan service. Whereas Genesis stands as its own story. Telling the story not because it wants to explain, but because it wants to use the opportunity to tell a story. And for that, it's all the stronger. Before going into that though, we'll start with the production. Genesis was directed by David Maloney, a stalwart of Who at this time who we've already covered multiple times already, not least for Planet of the Daleks, just 2 Dalek stories previously. Maloney was a very distinguished director of Doctor Who and did some excellent work for the series, and this is among his very best. Some of the shots of the story are just breathtakingly good. The opening scene is probably my favourite opening moment of any story. The close-ups of the soldiers, all gas masked and faceless, then torn down by machine gun fire instantly. It really drives home the brutality of this situation and war in general. Maloney also does a great job heightening tension and atmosphere. The scene where the Mutos chase Sarah does a fantastic job of heightening the terror Sarah is facing despite being chased by a guy in a few rags. Additionally, the scene where the Mutos and Sarah get captured by the Fowls does a fantastic job of turning a polystyrene set into a really quite foreboding place. He's also very wise with what he shows and doesn't show. The scene where Ronson shows the Doctor and Harry the Dalek embryos is 1,000 times more convincing with letting their faces show us all we need to know, rather than relying on probably crap special effects. He also experiments a bit. The rubbish cliffhanger where Sarah falls off the gantry is enhanced by a freeze frame that Maloney would later use again for Planet of Evil. But Maloney succeeds best when it comes to the Daleks and their creator. Davros' first shot is a masterpiece, one that shocks the viewer as we see this strange man with the bottom half of a Dalek. Maloney has a brilliant habit of shooting Davros completely motionless, giving us this fantastic uncanny valley feeling with him, really hammering home that he's really only half a man at this point. As for the Daleks themselves, remember that they spend most of the story as muscle pretty much, but Maloney uses this to his advantage by making them look among the most menacing they've ever looked. Arguably this is the only time in the whole colour era of the classic series where they've looked as menacing and powerful as they managed in the power of the Daleks. Maloney uses a few tricks. Firstly, he shoots them in shadow much of the time. Frankly, I could gush for hours about how well the final scene of part 1 where Davros and the Dalek are revealed is directed, because it is exquisite. The way the Dalek is basked in shadow gives it so much menace. Secondly, he shoots them from below where possible. A great scene is after the massacre of the Fowls where a Dalek is seen above one of the trenches, looking hugely imposing, and it works even better because of the context of the scene where they've essentially massacred the entire Fowl people. It's a simple trick of course, but it makes the Dalek shape look so much more of a threat, and is of course enhanced by the lighting. Finally, his trick, especially later in the story, is to shoot the in theory mundane action of them going through a corridor more or less head on, with the camera tracking backwards, really giving them this impending feeling. All in all, so much of why the Daleks feel like an unstoppable menace in the story comes from him, and that means that that's them at their very best. So yeah, Maloney does a fantastic job with this. The few duffs like the giant clam aren't really his fault. Frankly, he does more than that when he should. And overall, it's a brilliantly directed piece. Intensive, tense, atmospheric, everything it needed. As for the rest of the production, giant clam aside, well, and I can't pretend I'm a huge fan of the gunmetal grey look for the Daleks, but apart from those things, the design actually is fantastic, particularly location shoots, which look far less like a quarry than they had any right to. The sets also look very good, hardly world-beating, but then again the classic series didn't have the budget for world-beating, and it's dependable and fits the tone of the story well. Davros is of course a bit of design genius, combining the familiarity of the Dalek with that theme of this twisted man, both physically and in mind. It seems obvious now we're so used to the character, but giving him this proto-Dalek look gives us a valuable insight into who he is pretty much immediately. But yeah, for the sake of brevity, let's take "it's pretty good" as an answer. Then of course, good old Dudley Simpson, who can be frustratingly samey much of the time, but frankly avoids that particular chestnut and delivers a fantastic score. The Dalek theme here is absolutely perfect, and combined with Maloney's direction gives this vibe of them being totally unstoppable. It's menacing, pounding, and absolutely brilliant. It's also better than his usual fare in the quieter moments as well, much sharper and more tense than usual. I said before I have a similar view to Simpson as I do to Murray Gold. It was overused in my view of them, not the idea they couldn't both pull off brilliant scores on occasion, but yeah, this story counts as a brilliant score. Anyway, that's enough of that. Let's look at the script. As mentioned, Nation was prompted into doing the story to avoid him doing the same bored idea yet again, and it seems to have invigorated him, letting him engage with the thematic depth he'd left behind in the 60s before now, and allowing him to really explore the Daleks. It is, however, worth mentioning that much of what makes the story works probably comes from Robert Holmes, the new script editor. Holmes is probably Doctor Who's greatest writer and got the show like I don't think anyone else ever has, and I suspect a lot of the character interactions and dialogue are his work. Nation can be a brilliant writer in a lot of ways, but dialogue was never quite his strong suit. But that Moffat-y whiff at awkwardness is completely absent here, so as I said, I suspect Holmes quietly made a lot of alterations. How much was down to each man is something lost to history, but I think we can safely assume the thematic depth and the strong flowing story beats were Nation, and the character and dialogue suffers Holmes given their respective strengths as writers. In any case, this is Nation back in his element, getting to deal with war, fascism, societal decay, all stuff that permeates his general canon of work. In the previous two stories, he had nothing to say and no idea how to say it. In this story, he very much knows what he wants to say and says it just so brilliantly. And well, it's not difficult to come to the conclusion that he suddenly gave a shit when he most certainly did not about what came before. That's how things can be, can they not? It's not really going to be possible to sort of split everything into neat little sections to examine, so this is going to be a bit haphazard and go back and forth between a lot of different elements of the story. That's because everything is extremely intertwined. If I discuss a character, it's inevitably going to lead to discussion about themes, and if I try and sort them, it will just be a mess, so I'll just let it naturally become a mess. More so than usual, anyway. I'll start by examining some of the more minor characters of the piece, and how I think they do a good job of demonstrating the themes on display. In terms of its depiction of Khaled society, it's really interesting how we see the people who are involved with the rise of fascism, and in this case its opponents. Take Ronson, the man who dislikes what's going on, but feels he has no means to oppose it. Yet he does end up doing shows that he's a man with no stomach for the fight, and is thus very easy pickings when the fascists need their scapegoat. He's then replaced by Garman in a very similar role, but Garman shows off two important differences. He's a far more effective opposition, being from the black uniform security lot, he's a bit more savvy, but not savvy enough to avoid getting conned by Nida, and then in the end betrayed by Davros, but we'll get to that. Secondly, he shows the kind of person who was happy with fascism up to a point. Using horrifyingly immoral science to destroy the enemies who we consider inferior, well that's fine. It's only the Daleks being made quite so pitiless that causes his realisation. These two characters show how otherwise ordinary people can be chewed up and spat out by such a merciless ideology, and how the less scrupulous ones can find their breaking point. But in this case, it wasn't enough. Garman's idealism and unwillingness to totally let go of the scientific ideals, and indeed perhaps a smidgen of loyalty to Davros, means he blinks at the wrong time and Davros can have them all killed. He missed his chance and he paid for it. Compromise was never really an option. The parallels, of course, with both the way fascism rose in the 1920s and 30s, and the way it's arguably been in the rise since the West since the 2008 financial crisis, are obvious, and the way Khaled society as a whole is portrayed also is part of this. The first scenes with them in Part 1 show exactly what kind of society we're dealing with here. One where General Raven can scream about the total extermination of the Fouls with such passion and conviction, something that can only be born out of true hatred. This is at the heart of fascist societies, one which Nida takes a step further later in the episode by saying coldly and calmly, but with no less sincerity in his belief, of the necessity to keep the Khaled race pure. It's of course a lot less subtle than you'd get from today's fascists who try and cloud it in their various rhetorics, but remember this is not a society descending into fascism, it's a society already very much there. But then you have to remember, fascism isn't one size fits all. There's Mussolini and then there's Hitler after all. The rise of Davros, someone who wants to take it even further to an extreme beyond an extreme, ends up with the absolutely brilliant, in storytelling terms, situation where Raven, who as you recall I just said spent Part 1 screaming about how inferior the Fouls were, is suddenly treating the Doctor and Harry's claims with concern and is being seen almost as a voice of reason only a few episodes later. It says a few things, that the hatred at the core of the society is so ingrained, someone who would record in horror at what Davros is doing with the Daleks still harbours the fanatical belief in his own superiority. And remember Garman, who we treat most of the story as a good guy, he was in favour of the Daleks, to the point where he was the one assisting Davros in the initial weapons test, right up until Davros pushed it just a bit too far. On purpose, I think, we're never really told what his opinions on the war and the Fouls are, and, well, I'm not sure they'd be what we want to hear. This is not so much a cautionary tale or anything like that. As I said, this is already a fascist society through and through, and a few individual stories doesn't mean this is trying to portray that full, but more of a way of setting up this world in which the Daleks would very believably come into being. The core of hatred that led to the Daleks being designed with it at their core would only have made sense coming from a society like the Khaleds are here. As for the Fouls, well, I certainly think it was a bold move that is very much in the story's favour to make them very different than they had been before. It was only back in Planet of the Daleks that the Fouls were a plucky bunch of heroes, and here, yeah, they're definitely not. It is true that they do not appear to be as bad as the Khaleds. The idea of racial superiority that emanates from the Khaleds is far less prominent. In fact, I'd say it's mostly limited to some anti-Muto comments from the soldiers. What they are, though, is, well, to put it bluntly, arseholes. The pacifists of the first story are nowhere to be seen, as they prepare their giant rocket to wipe out the Khaleds using slave labour with sadistic soldiers. This is a look at another important influence on the Daleks: war. War is of course linked to fascism in an extremely important way, particularly in the two world wars. The outcome of the first led to its rise, and the second was it being put into practice and failing that test to survive. The imagery of the wars is rife throughout this story. That fantastic opening scene is very remnant of the First World War, what with soldiers and gas masks going over the top like that, and the use of trenches throughout similarly echoes it, while the second is rather more obviously evoked for all the fascist imagery. The Fouls, therefore, to me at least, are an examination of what war can do to a society. Not break it entirely like fascism did, there are some Fouls who appear to be decent people, but warp it, turning the survival instinct into a hatred instinct. The Fouls' reliance on their rocket to destroy the entire coloured people is less of the extermination stuff Raven was ranting about, but more a cold-hearted desire to win by any means necessary. After all, the Allies did some terrible things during the Second World War because it was felt the survival of their way of life was worth the price. Even if that price was their souls. In all this thematic richness, driven by just a few elements of the story, there are of course Nation's usual quirks. For instance, the threatening-looking stalker early in the story who ends up being completely friendly. I'm pretty sure the Dalek invasion of Earth and the Chase are the only two Dalek stories where they don't pull that off. Or a solitary woman in the proceedings who becomes a close ally of the Doctor, usual tropes like that. But it works for two reasons. Firstly, the surrounding interior was so much better than it was in something like Death to the Daleks. Minor cliches like this are very, very forgivable. Secondly, the characters have more to them than usual. Better, for instance, is our look at how the Death Fouls can be decent people, but war has nevertheless shaped her into someone tough and ruthless. She's not proposing to destroy the entrance in the bunker and kill the Doctor because of hatred or anything like that, just cold, hard logic. Severin the Muto, on the other hand, risks his own life to save them, showing he is as capable and brave as the rest of them. It seems obvious to you and me, but remember how many characters in the story compare the Mutos to animals. This character, in his own small way, contributes to proving fascism wrong. As I said, a big part of why the story succeeds is that Nation using the origin of the Daleks to tell a rich thematic piece, rather than using it to explain the origin of the Daleks. Because this isn't really a piece that builds on previous Dalek works in a plot sense. It's totally incompatible with the first story, as I've already mentioned, to the point where a huge number of explanations have been bandied around as to how the Daleks can go from how they are here to how they were there, and frankly, much like the unit dating controversy, I personally think it's not really even bothering to try. What it does do is build on them with thematic sense. Ian's statement back in the first story that the Daleks were obsessed with their dislike for the unlike. In seeing the circumstances of their creation, we understand why that was the case. Hell, I doubt this was the intention because all evidence points to Nation barely paying attention to power if we even ever bothered watching it. But that portrayal in that story, intelligent, scheming, cunning, patient, yet absolutely ruthless and single-minded, leads so naturally from how they were portrayed here, it seems almost a shame it wasn't intentional. That's why it's so effective. It takes the opportunities the plot has and makes sure it's done exactly right where it matters. As for the plot and story structure, well, let's not beat around the bush. It's night and fucking day compared to the previous two stories. While they meandered aimlessly, particularly Death to the Daleks, where wandering through corridors seems to be the main feature, Genesis is tight and focused, moving in a well-paced and logical sequence of events that all lead into each other very naturally. Because it's a six-parter, there's a bit of faffing about. It's always done with the utmost care, though. For instance, in part 1, the Doctor and Harry escape to be recaptured again, but it's a sequence that exists for character purposes for the Doctor and for Nyder as well, showing that it's time used effectively. The extra time is also used to allow the plot to proceed at its own pace and not be rushed. Therefore, Garman's rebellion against Davros is allowed to be built at a realistic pace, and comes about as a result of events, dear boy, rather than being exposited to us like, well, let's be honest, would happen in NuWho. It also, of course, expertly threads the different parts of the stories together in the background, which leads to the Daleks turning on Davros being both an effective surprise and one that has already been built up throughout the story subtly. Therefore, instead of feeling like an arse pull, the audience learns with Davros just how much of a hole he's dug himself. It's little things like that that really make the story feel like the complete package. In fact, the only time the plot really falters is, as I mentioned earlier, when Nation is forced back into Doctor Who's box. The giant clams to give our typical rubber monster and the rocket escape that forms the cliffhanger between parts 2 and 3, that seems to be there so that Sarah can fall off and we can have a cliffhanger out of it. These are very minor things that don't detract from the story overall, but shows the Nation was very much in his element here, and it's only when he was taken out of that element that did the story even briefly falter. Honestly, though, it's just a really good plot. It's exciting, engaging, tense, it has some fantastic hooks. The time ring is a pretty obvious device, but it means that all the actions of the Doctor and co have a logical motivation which serves the story very well. I won't repeat myself much more, but Nation really outdoes himself here. I'll also quickly touch on what I think Holmes added to proceedings. Well, much of the character stuff for the regulars I think was probably him. After all, as script editor, he would have been developing the new Doctor, while I doubt Baker had even been cast while Nation was putting the story together. As I said earlier, the dialogue is very Holmesian throughout, sharp and witty, but always natural. For all his talents, Nation did struggle with dialogue, and it's difficult to see him pulling off "No tea, Harry," which is the kind of thing which certainly came from Holmes. This combination, Nation's strength for themes and ideas, and Holmes' total and utter understanding of Doctor Who, and his ability to bring the natural dialogue and all of that stuff out of it, is probably very key to this story's success. This story, comes extremely early in the Fourth Doctor's run, only his fourth story, and out of those previous four, one had been created by the previous production team, and therefore was a bit of an odd one out in terms of setting it up, and another was a quick two-part location story to fill a gap, meaning, arguably, this is only really his second proper story. We've already looked at the Ark in Space, the only other story that came before this one. In fact, it was the first Classic Who video I made. The passage of time. Anyway, that's the story where the Fourth Doctor's character was established. Crafty and playful, but also with an extremely strong moral core and laser focus and determination. This story does a wonderful job of continuing to develop his character in this direction, and showing the great many layers to him. His self-righteous stubbornness is on display in the opening scene with the Time Lord, wearing an odd prototype of a headdress that would be established as Time Lord standard in Deadly Assassin 2 years later, I might add. But as soon as the Time Lord mentions the Daleks, that changes. "You can't tell me what to do" becomes "tell me more," as he realises the gravity of the situation being presented to him. He shows himself to be a brilliant obfuscator and manipulator. He makes mincemeat out of Raven, making him look like a complete fool in his own playful style, and seems to be ready to do similar with a scanner operator. But the veneer drops when the time ring is taken away, and so on and so on. The story demonstrates how the Doctor is more willing to stick his tongue out than the Third would be, but just as, if not more likely, to put it back in when the situation becomes truly serious. The main way the Doctor's character is explored in this story, though, is through his mission, and how effectively his dedication to it is portrayed. His urgency in solving it is nevertheless portrayed through his ethos in doing so, finding the peaceful solution, trying to negotiate, hold up to his morals and ideas, and only when that doesn't work he becomes more and more desperate and pushes himself further and further. How he threatens Davros with his convenient "press here if you want to turn off life support for plot reasons" button shows the desperation, and how he's pushing himself to measures he'd never normally take. I think it's frankly impossible to imagine the Third Doctor growling at Davros that he'll kill him if he doesn't comply, and it really shows how strong the Doctor's sense of morals and duty is. This, of course, leads to the story's crowning scene, and probably its most famous. The Doctor, having concluded that only genocide will allow him to complete this mission, wires up the incubator room for the Daleks with explosives, and holds the two wires before him, knowing that simply touching them together will finish the job. And he hesitates. Hesitates long enough that he can be presented with an alternative, and when that alternative falls through, the window of opportunity that existed in this moment has closed. Given what happened to the Doctor later with the Time War, it's difficult not to imagine this as a moment all the NuWho Doctors have later regretted. And indeed, it's hard not to imagine the First Doctor easily rationalising his way towards putting those wires together, or the Sixth Doctor to sigh but do it easily, or the Seventh Doctor to... Well, let's be honest, the Seventh Doctor probably would have headed for the incubator room with a stack of TNT under his arm before the Time Lord would even finish the explanation. And even, say, the Fifth Doctor. I think he would have considered it strongly, but ultimately I know what choice he would have made. The one in Warriors of the Deep he made similarly for the Silurians. It broke him as he regretted there wasn't another way, but he would have done it. But none of those Doctors were there, the Fourth Doctor was, and he hesitated. The thing is, with genocide like this, it's actually very different from what you'd call a genocide in the world we actually live in. Because the ability of one person to wipe out an entire species like that is only something that exists in the realms of science fiction. To use time travel or a super weapon or something like that in order to achieve it is obviously not stuff that exists in the real world. Genocide in the real world requires the apparatus of a state, the compliance and complicity of thousands of people, and overwhelming force over those the genocide is being perpetrated upon. The idea of someone like the Doctor, one man having the power to destroy a race as powerful and pitiless as the Daleks, is only a dilemma that can exist in speculative fiction, and it's therefore important to remember this question. The morals at play here, they aren't actually real questions. In real life, one person cannot hold this power as the Doctor does here. There can be situations where many lives can be in the hands of one person, but the fate of an entire species, and the fate of countless trillions across the ages the existence of that species would affect, no. The story, I think, is all the braver for looking at this question despite that. Because this isn't necessarily a look at the morals of what he's doing, even though they are important. I think more importantly, it's a look into the Doctor's soul. That's not to say the questions brought up here don't have moral implications. Is it right to do one evil thing to prevent much more evil being done? The Doctor points out that killing a child who you're told would later become a ruthless dictator would be something very few people could truly bring themselves to do, because that child has not yet committed those acts. But also because killing a child is truly an unconscionable act, and even in the name of the greater good it would be something an ordinary person would find very difficult to live with. And yet, is this not perhaps a false equivalence? This is not a child. Sarah rightly points out, these are the Daleks, pitiless killers who have already perpetrated their own genocide against the Thals even before this conversation. This is not the case of killing the innocent to save the innocent. It therefore comes back to what I mean about peering into the Doctor's soul. Does he truly believe this is comparable to the child's situation, or is there something he's trying to tell himself because deep down he does not want this act on his conscience? I suspect his argument that future allies will come together because of the fear of the Daleks is the same. Yeah, bringing people together is a laudable goal, but is that really worth the death and destruction the Daleks will bring? I'm not so sure. But again, this is where it comes back to the fact that this is a dilemma that can only exist in fiction, because this is a power no human has ever really had. It's impossible to know how someone would ever really react, so we only have to go off the Doctor's character, and indeed, the Doctor's character leads to him posing that one immortal question.
Do I have the right?
Does he have the right? Does anyone have the right to make such a consequential decision, to decide they know best for the universe, and to destroy in the name of good? I don't know, and again, for the millionth time, because of the situation it can only really exist in science fiction, I'm not sure anyone can really give an answer to that. But one way or another, the Doctor is making a choice. He is either choosing to kill the Daleks or to save them, but the latter has consequences, the misery and destruction the Daleks will cause. And I think the Doctor is aware of this, despite his arguments, because he doesn't just throw the wires down and make the decision. He's not trying to stop himself from doing it, he's just paralysed by the dilemma. He desperately does not want to become what he hates the most, but deep down he knows he couldn't live with himself if he doesn't act here. Does he have the right? Perhaps not. Perhaps that's a decision for gods beyond the realms of men. Perhaps he does. Perhaps all the right he needs are those wires and the explosives will do the rest. What we're seeing here is the Doctor faced with a decision that will cost him his soul either way. It's therefore understandable that when Garman shows up with another solution, the Doctor probably breathes out for the first time since he picked up the wires, knowing his soul is saved. But once he sees this attempt at a peaceful solution gunned down, he makes his decision and goes back to finish the job, albeit too late to finish it entirely. What an amazing scene. It truly deserves all its praise, and frankly I barely scratched the surface with this one because there's so much scope for discussion. This is Doctor Who looking at some of the deepest moral questions there are, and is all the better for it using its unique perspective and the opportunity of the plot to do so. As I've said, Nation uses this opportunity not to explain, but to explore. We're exploring what being in this situation does to the Doctor. Before I move on, I wish to naturally praise the performance of Tom Baker. I said before he essentially fit into the role immediately in a way fewer of the other actors ever have, and here he gives a masterpiece of the performance while still brand new in the role. It's a testament to his skills that he found the part so easily, and he does an amazing job here. His delivery and the subtleties of his physical acting all combine for an absolutely standout performance. I won't, however, dwell on it because there's still as much else to talk about, and I'll have plenty of opportunities to discuss his performances, but yeah, it's fantastic here. As for the other regulars, Sarah and Harry play a very similar role in this story as both the natural companion role as the audience identification, but also as the Doctor's moral compasses. Sarah is of course one of the most beloved companions of all time, and Harry always a very likeable presence. He was of course a holdover from a different previous view of this era in which the Doctor would revert to being a Hartnell-like figure and would need an Ian to do the physical stuff, and as that was obviously no longer required, Harry was quickly shunned aside at the start of the next season. He nevertheless was always a likeable presence, helped by Ian Marter's performance, and it does seem like a bit of a shame they didn't do more with him, although admittedly the fourth Doctor-Sarah duo is one that has become iconic and would have been hard to top. Starting with Sarah though, she's on her typical form throughout much of the story, leading the slave revolt against the Thals as just a day in the office for her, really. She's also an important contrast with other characters. Her concern for the Doctor at the end of the story contrasts with Betton's happy to talk using the explosives, showing her moral convictions and loyalty to the Doctor versus the war-hardened views of others. Her moral importance is all shown most vitally in the Do I Have the Right scene, though, where she is the voice trying to persuade the Doctor to destroy the Daleks. Her reasons for this are layered. Firstly, she has met the Daleks before and has seen what they can do. Now, admittedly, this would be a bit stronger of an argument if that hadn't been in Death to the Daleks, where they defined pathetic, but we won't hold that against this story. More importantly, though, she is seeing this in her own moral terms, which is simple. She wants good to succeed, and destroying the Daleks that are evil will achieve that. Her moral stance is not more wrong than the Doctor's or even less complex, but it shows that she doesn't have the same moral point of view as him, and presents the argument to the Doctor that no doubt his own conscience is providing him as well. Do what's right, even if it's not a nice way to do it. Who's in the right, of course, is up to the individual audience member, but it's a very effective way of showing that the Doctor is not necessarily in the moral right here. If his loyal companion is willing to debate it, then the audience should be too. Harry provides a different purpose, especially in the earlier parts of the story. Given how the Doctor had disparaged him in the Ark in Space, the landmine scene early in Part 1 is an important moment of character growth where he shows extreme ability and courage, and shows the Doctor's trust in him take a major step forward. Part of his main purpose, though, is to act as the audience relation character as the companion should. Having not met the Daleks before, he learns as the story goes on, and therefore provides a helpful point for exposition, etc. This of course plays into his presence at the big moral decision. He's silent, not coming to either side, which makes him essentially the viewer, unsure of which side to take and unsure of which decision is the right one. Finally, we come on to the last set of characters we need to look at. Let's start with Nyder. Nyder is truly one of my favourite villain characters of all time from Doctor Who. Firstly, the performance by Peter Miles is absolutely impeccable, one of the absolute greats of all time. It's a chilling, subtle but powerful performance in which the shades of the character are always on display. There's always just a sense of offness about him, but he really is as slimy as he seems. When Nyder is tricking Garman, you almost believe that he's telling the truth, but there's something just not right about it, which is perfect for the vibe they're going for, and Miles hits it perfectly. The writing is also impeccable though. Nyder is the perfect representation of the fascist true believer, the fanatic who will coldly and without hesitation call his support for the purity of his race, and who will follow his fascistic leader without hesitation. He's a pretty obvious representation of those Nazis who fanatically followed Hitler until the very end, convinced of their leader's infallibility even as everything crumbled around them. Nyder's devotion to Davros may be because of his admiration of his ethos and worldview, or perhaps he really is convinced by the Dalek project. We don't know, we don't need to know, but it rarely wavers. When it does, it's only when Nyder is convinced that Davros is letting that power slip away. That's the only time he questions his boss, and the veneer slips as he lets his anger that Davros is apparently letting all this go show. Perhaps there might also be some personal reasons for this. Nyder doesn't want to lose his position or be at the mercy of the rebels, but there's also no doubt of his loyalty, and it is really just so well executed, showing how people can fall behind a dear leader in such a fascist society. It also makes his demise all that more fitting. The one thing in which he always believed, the rightness of his leader, is what is his undoing, as he is the first victim of Davros' fatal mistake with the Daleks. They exterminate him as Davros tries to get them back under control. And so the comparison is clear. So many fanatical followers of Hitler died in the bunkers in the closing day of the war as their leader's plans suffered their final collapse. Nyder's loyalty to Davros ended in much the same way. As for Davros himself, well, it's easy to look at the character in the context of arguable overuse after the last 50 years. Certainly there would not be until NuWho that we'll be seeing another Dalek story without him involved is testament to that, and decide that the problems of those later stories diminish him here. I think that's very much wrong though, firstly because we can't hold the decisions of later production teams against this story, but also because in the context of the story, Davros isn't meant to be a recurring enemy. He's the one-off creator of the Daleks who meets his fate at the end. Now, I do understand why they brought him back later. The idea of the single face of the Daleks to converse with the Doctor about moral quandaries is a good opportunity for storytelling, and these interactions usually boost otherwise mediocre stories. And that's because, well, Davros is such a brilliant character, let's be honest, and most of that brilliance comes from his conception here. To be frank, the idea of the single creative figure is only one that seems logical in hindsight, if you ask me. Nothing from their first story in particular gave the impression that was the case. And yet, in this case, it is done by Nation not only for once again, not for explanation, but a time with the themes of the story. A man motivated by hatred and the desire for survival at all costs being driven to extreme things. Davros is the ultimate fascist, in his belief in the disposability of the individual towards the greater goal of ultimate power. His belief, no matter what statements he makes about science or the survival of his race, is in his own power, and he has chosen the Daleks as the means of achieving it. Yet he is more than that, an enigma, one which defies simple explanation. He is utterly ruthless towards achieving power, his fascistic beliefs drive his actions, and there's nothing he won't sacrifice to achieve that, including the lives of his entire people. And yet there's more to it. Quiet moments where he seems not just a power-hungry maniac, but truly calculating mind, one who manipulates and schemes. He is everyone in this story, arguably even the Doctor wrapped around his finger, except for, it transpires, his own creations. My favourite scene in the story, one of the greatest of all time in the show's history in my view, is the one where the Doctor poses this question to Davros.
Davros, if you had created a virus in your laboratory, something contagious and infectious that killed on contact, a virus that would destroy all other forms of life, would you allow its use?
It is an interesting conjecture.
Would you do it?
The only living thing. A microscopic organism. Reigning supreme. A fascinating idea.
But would you do it?
It's a genius scene because of how it explores their characters so effectively. The Doctor is willing to test Davros to see how far he'll go and thus what action he has to take, whether he can convince Davros to end it or whether he'll have to take desperate measures. As for Davros, just prior to the question being asked, the Doctor posed that the Daleks were evil, and Davros seemed almost offended at the idea. It's just survival. Davros sees it as perfectly logical and reasonable that to do that they must crush all other races and become the dominant species. It really asks the question, is Davros doing what he thinks is right based on his own worldview and logic, as warped and twisted as it may be? It really gave the impression that perhaps we've been reading him wrong. And yet that question, the simple one the Doctor asks, tears down the facade in an instant.
Yes. Yes. To hold in my hand a capsule that contained such power. To know that life and death on such a scale was my choice. To know that the tiny pressure on my thumb, enough to break the glass, would end everything. Yes. I would do it. That power would set me up above the gods. And through the Daleks, I shall have that power!
It's all about power. That's all it is. Perhaps he has convinced himself that this is just about peace and wars ending, as he says. Perhaps he's telling himself that, or perhaps he's lying just to the Doctor. Through whatever remains of his teeth, I guess. It doesn't matter, he is lying, either to others or to himself, and this is just about putting himself on the podium. And yet, the analogy the Doctor uses is very much an apt one. The virus, uncontrollable, which will kill and devastate without reason or mercy, there's no way Davros could control that. No mechanism he could use to really harness it, and no guarantee it wouldn't consume him the moment he breaks that glass. The virus is the Daleks, and Davros finds out as is the case far too late. Of course, the character would be nothing without the incredible performance from Michael Wisher, who of course had to act while being behind a restrictive rubber mask and only able to move one hand, but he still absolutely knocks it out of the park with one of the best performances the show has ever done. He portrays Davros as calm and reasonable, but always with a hint that there's a frustration about him whenever he has to give respect to someone. And then, of course, whenever that mask is dropped, he does such a brilliant raving mad performance, one that, of course, thanks to excellent sound design, makes him sound more and more like a Dalek. It's a perfect balance that no future Davros actor ever really managed, the others either doing a good insane Davros but not really a great subtle Davros, or vice versa. And then, of course, there's the Daleks themselves. It's funny, really, as they spend most of the story just following orders and having little real agency of their own, and yet somehow they come about as just so much more menacing than they ever did during the Pertwee era. Part of this is how they're shot, of course, the shadows and all that, but also how they're portrayed. When Davros first shows the Daleks to the scientists, it, without much prompting, tries to exterminate the aliens. Just a single shout and it shows the cold reality of what the Daleks are. We then don't really see much of them until they're ordered by Davros to go and exterminate the Fouls, and it's utterly shocking and makes them so powerful in how they wipe out the Fouls pretty much in an instant. The shooting, music, sound design all help, but here, Nation has given the Daleks a sense of power despite not even acting on their own agency. Well, because simply there's no being beaten up by mummies or being pushed into ice water by a few blokes or falling off the Mary Celeste. There's just these unstoppable, merciless killers that an entire race of people who've been at war for 1,000 years had absolutely no means of stopping. Likewise, when Davros orders them in to destroy the rebellion against him, it feels shocking and hopeless how this great hope of the Doctor's, that this peaceful rebellion will stop Davros' plans, and it's just wiped out in seconds. But of course, they're acting on Davros' orders. They're not really being the Daleks, they're, being intelligent, ruthless and cunning. Here they're just fetching and carrying. Would you like more tea, Davros? And all that. Until, of course, the production line starts up, and Nida's attempt to stop it ends in his extermination. The whole thing comes crashing down for Davros. He broke the glass, and now he can't control the virus. It's just masterfully done, as Davros cries out every possible reason he can think of for the Daleks to obey him, and every one they counter perfectly logically. Because he was the one who made them that way. They obey no one, they need no one's help, they are the superior beings that recognise no other life as worth living, and they certainly do not recognise pity. In one stroke, the two storylines, that of the Daleks and their creator, come to their natural conclusion, as Davros' hubris leads to his extermination at the hands of his creations. The creations that he can no longer control. The Daleks now seem at their most powerful despite having just been entombed, because all the power they demonstrated early in the story now has been unshackled. Then they were acting like the Daleks, now they are thinking like the Daleks. This ending for Davros, then this beginning for the Daleks is absolutely perfect. In my view, without a doubt, the Daleks' finest ever hour. This is the story of their genesis, and this is the final moment of that genesis, the moment when they become the Daleks. I love this story, I really do. Yeah, I know, it has nostalgia value as such an early foray into the classic series for me, but I wouldn't have ended up loving it so much if it didn't deliver. It has a brilliant production, a smart and engaging story, flawless thematic and character work, and the Daleks, ever so briefly, back to their very best, powerful yet cunning. It approaches this as using the story of the creation of the Daleks to tell a story about fascism and morality, and to explore the characters involved with it, and to create the circumstances in which we watch the moment in which the Daleks become what they're meant to be. Yeah, there's a giant clam and a silly cliffhanger where Sarah falls, but these small things take nothing away from what is a highly entertaining and engaging piece. This is truly one of the greats, and it's a shame the lessons learned about the Daleks here, making them seem powerful and intelligent, which had definitely been lost during the Pertwee era, are lost again going forward throughout the rest of the classic series, and only for a brief time early in NuWho did they rediscover this menace. So we look at this as the Daleks perhaps at their very much height. Final score for this story is therefore 10 out of 10. Among the very best of the classic series. Smart, engaging, thematically rich, and so forth, I need repeat myself no more. It deserves its reputation as a classic fully, and 50 years has not dented that in any way. This story does hold a special place in my heart from when I was a child, but now it holds one as someone writing serious analysis and criticism. It's just an excellent story, and well, that's the bottom line I'll leave this on.